Hello and welcome to another episode of the Project Purple podcast. I'm Dino Verling, founder and CEO of Project Purple. We have an exciting interview coming up with a very special guest after a few quick updates. Since 2010, we've contributed over $3 million and counting to pancreatic cancer research efforts. We have also allocated over $1 million worth of aid to more than 1,300 patients and families through our patient aid programs. Your monthly or one-time gift can improve patients' lives through research and assistance programs. You can donate now at projectpurple.org. Pancreatic cancer does not rest, and neither will we. Your support is truly appreciated. If you're looking to get involved in one of our many events, whether that means joining a run team, participating in a virtual run walk, group fitness, golf, or anything else you can think of, visit projectpurple.org/events to learn more. Without further ado, let's meet our special guest this morning as we record this, coming to us all the way, I always like to say this term, across the pond, as they say. Even it's not really a pond, it's an ocean. But Dan McNamee, originally from Cleveland, lives in Paris, but just happens to be in London. Welcome to the Project Purple podcast to share your story with pancreatic cancer.
Yeah, very pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I know we were playing catch up before we hit record. We are both big fans of London, Project Purple. I know I said this is not about us, but I'll throw in a shameless plug here, Dan, before we get to your story. We have been an official charity partner with the London Marathon. I know we were not playing, but we were talking about London, and I've been there the last couple of years because of the marathon. We have a huge team, our biggest team in 2025 of 30 runners that we'll be bringing over to London. We're super excited. Just an amazing city. So if anyone has not been to London, 2025 would be a great opportunity. Run with Project Purple, see the sights. London's got a lot to offer.
It's supposed to be a great marathon too.
Phenomenal marathon, flat, a couple of turns in there because you got to weave around London for 26.2. Epic finish in front of Buckingham Palace on the Mall there. But as we both agreed, and I guess if we say it on here on the podcast, I guess it's like it's for real versus like if you don't say it, I guess. But London is probably the most diverse city in the entire planet, entire world.
That's how I've always found it. I mean, I think it's difficult for an East Coaster or a New Yorker to say something like that. I feel like the people are going to get angry with you. It's easier for a Clevelander maybe to say it, but no, London's it's an unbelievable city. I've lived here, don't live here anymore, but I've lived here for years off and on. It's an absolutely incredible city. So,
yeah, and I'm a native New Englander. I've lived here my whole life. And I've got to agree with that. I mean, I fell in love with it with my wife 20 years ago when we went there for the first time, and we were a lot younger, didn't have kids. So it was a much different experience. And now being able to go back for the London Marathon, it is just such a cool city. As we have talked, before, it's so different than I think any of the big cities here in the United States. Oh, yeah, I mean, I guess New York kind of relates a little bit, maybe Chicago. I mean, I've been in New York and Chicago a lot, but the diversity in London is just unbelievable. And, I'm a big food guy and we didn't even really talk about this, but I've had some of the best Mexican tacos.
Oh, you get great food. Yeah.
In London. Mm-hmm. With authentic.
That wasn't true 20 years ago, though. No. It wasn't true 20 years ago.
No. This is like recent. And then, you could get amazing cheese. You can get amazing, I've actually had, Italian American first generation. I've had amazing Italian in London.
No, they've got it. Now I have to say, my Parisian wife will be very, very angry if I keep going on and on about London and I don't mention that Paris is also a lovely, lovely city. They're different animals entirely, but the French English beef is real. So my wife lived here. She likes London as well, but Paris is a great place too. Elodie, don't get mad at me.
I've never been to Paris. It's on my bucket list, but we'll get there eventually. So I can't speak to that. Well, let's get into it, Dan. Here's our opening segment is always a guest opportunity, to talk about their story, their journey with pancreatic cancer. So with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your story. I know I've got a little bit of background, but when we were connecting here before we record, we didn't really talk about anything because as I said, I like to hear it firsthand when we actually hit record here. So with that, the
Sure.
microphone and the camera are yours.
Yeah, so it was June 2020. I had a funny pain in my lower right leg, and I was 40 years old and still believed myself to be invincible, as young men do. And so I ignored it, and that kind of went away. And then about a week or two later, I had a funny pain in my lower left leg and my calf. It was sort of this deep throbbing pain. And my wife is smarter than I am. And so she forced me to go to the doctor in Paris. It was 30 June 2020. It was a lovely sunny day in Paris, and I rode my bike to the doctor. She couldn't figure out what it was, so she sent me up to a clinic that late morning, early afternoon. They did an ultrasound of my leg and found a blood clot in my calf, which is for a 40-year-old an odd thing to have. Hadn't been traveling any time, so they were a little bit suspicious, and then they sat me down for a CT scan to make sure that I didn't have any blood clots in my chest or anywhere else. It's sort of a precautionary CT scan. And there's 1,000 strange things that happened that day that I'll never forget. But I remember getting my CT scan, and I was laying there thinking, man, you hear about those people who wake up feeling normal one morning, and then they go to the doctor, and later in the afternoon, someone tells them they have cancer. And I was sitting there thinking, like, man, I feel terrible for those people. That must be horrible. And 20 minutes later, the French radiologist called me into the room, and he pointed at the screen and told me that I had a tumor on my pancreas. And I knew enough to know that pancreatic cancer is a bad one. I didn't know everything about it, but I knew, there are some cancers that can be blips relatively, and there are some cancers which are mountains to climb. And I was pretty clear that pancreatic cancer was one of the latter. So I ended up getting admitted to the hospital. I had a 4-year-old and a 9-month-old at the time. So it was devastating. It still exists in my mind in this sort of mist it's hard for me to remember what actually happened in those days that followed, or who was there or who I spoke to. So we were in Paris at the time. My family all lives in the States. I'm lucky enough to have some doctors in my family, and so we made the decision pretty early on to fly to Cleveland and start my treatment process there. And I was lucky enough to have insurance that sort of covered me both in France and in the United States. And so I did 9 months of chemotherapy in Cleveland. Myself, my wife, my 2 boys, we lived with my mom on the west side of Cleveland, which was difficult, but also hugely important and really, really powerful. So we had family help in that. So I did 9 months of chemo, and then I got in touch with the team. Her name is Dr. O'Reilly at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. She's sort of one of the experts in the field. Began a medical trial there, which was olaparib, so a PARP inhibitor drug, which is sort of one of the drugs that keep the cancerous cells from defending themselves and repairing themselves. And then immunotherapy, Keytruda was sort of layered on top of that. So I did that for about 2 years, at first flying back and forth between Cleveland and New York, and then eventually flying back and forth between Paris and New York every 6 weeks or so. Wound that up in the back end of that, about maybe 15 months into it, maybe 18 months into it, I started to get clean scans. So my tumors kept shrinking. So I had a tumor in the pancreas and a few tumors in the liver. And as my treatment went on, the tumors were shrinking. And towards the end of that first trial, I had my first clean scan. So I had my first scan where the tumor on my pancreas was no longer visible, and the tumors on my liver were determined to be sort of scar tissue, not growing. And at that point, finished up that first trial, started the second trial, which was a very, very early stage trial. I was just the third person to have done it, again, through Memorial Sloan Kettering. And I did that one last year, basically from March until June. I was in New York. That was extremely difficult, sort of physically, emotionally, and everything else. I was away from my wife, was away from my children. But that wrapped up at the end of May, beginning of June, and of 2023. And I am now more than a year off of all cancer treatment and still have clean scans. So, I had a virtual meeting with Dr. O'Reilly a few weeks ago. And I'm always sort of trying to figure out how to think about these things because, once you sort of live your normal life and somebody tells you have pancreatic cancer, there's a long and precipitous fall from wherever you were to the bottom. And it's always difficult in this process to build myself back up, to allow myself to sort of believe and be vulnerable in those things. And so I asked Dr. O'Reilly, how should I consider this clean scan? Am I out of the woods, or are there just fewer trees, or, how do I think about this? She said, well, just one data point, so it's difficult to say exactly what comes next. But she said that she would use the word complete remission to describe my current status, which is I never expected anyone to use the R word with me. I had not prepared that was even really a possibility. But she knows more about this stuff than I do. So I have to believe her that that's a real possibility. And, one of the reasons I wanted to come on the show, and one of the reasons I'm, running and doing a few things that I'm trying to do, is because there are people who are curing cancer, even this cancer. And I can't say that I had a ton of hope when I was going through this process. Looking where I am today, it's a remarkable and unbelievable position to be in. And there's going to be more of us. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to be on.
Wow. Well, first, Dan, thank you for sharing that. I got a ton of questions here. And that story is just so powerful. And I'm just going to say this, and we're going to go back to this. The confidence in your voice and how you told your story is pretty special. And so there's something there that we're going to hopefully not unwind, but we'll talk about here in a second. But I just want to go back to the very beginning. So if we go, and I know you said June 2020, you had this pain in your leg, you're overseas. Hindsight is also always 2020. If you look prior to like 2020, any health issues? I mean, you're 40 years old. Most 40-year-olds, like, like you said, feel invincible. You're on top of the world. You're overseas. I'm never,
40-year-old man is never going to die.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing that I had, so, the BRCA gene. So my sister, my grandmother on my mother's side died very young of breast cancer. And my sister, she's a doctor. She's very smart and forward thinking. And she got tested for the BRCA mutation, BRCA. And she tested positive. I then got tested, and I tested positive as well. So
you have the BRCA.
Yeah, the BRCA mutation, which actually was really important. And once you get cancer, if you have the BRCA mutation, it's actually a good thing because it opens up some treatment options. But even with the BRCA mutation, for a male, it increases risks, but it's not like it is for a female where the risk of breast cancer and ovarian skyrockets. So I knew I had the BRCA, but it wasn't a material issue to my mind.
So let's talk about that, because that was a question here, genetics. And as you were telling your journey and the treatments, I was kind of thinking, all right. And so did you have genetic testing before this or during this whole process? Okay. So you knew before any of this, like, hey, I was a BRCA carrier.
About 2 years before. Yeah. No,
Okay,
maybe
so
a little bit more, 3 years.
I just want to spend a minute on this. Why did you get it? Was it because your sister insisted? Because most people, and this is where I'm going, like most people who have like, there's two sides I've seen doing this 14 years, and I'll share some personal experience with this. Again, not that this is about us here, but I think people fall in this line where, hey, they don't want to know because for whatever reason, and then some people want to know.
Mm-hmm.
So you went down the road that, hey, you wanted to know because your sister insisted, or just because of family?
No, my sister didn't insist. She and I are very close, but we're both independent and stubborn. She wouldn't be able to make me do anything. It was more. Well, there's two things. One, if you know you have it, there are you start getting colonoscopies a bit earlier and things like that. So there are things that you're supposed to do as a result. Two, I was about to have a kid, and then I had a second kid, and particularly for girls, that's stuff that's useful to know. And three, because my siblings are all doctors, I'm the only non-doctor. I have a comfort with, like, I'm not scared of the medical system. I'm not scared of doctors. So that information to me is not necessarily anxiety producing. It's more gives me something to take action on. And it was really precipitated, I think, because I was having kids and we didn't know if it was going to be a boy or a girl. And that would be useful information to have, not necessarily when they're born, but for the future.
Yeah. I think you nailed it. I mean, I think knowledge is power. Like, we were talking before we hit record, like this is what this podcast has become, is like this knowledge, like this bank of stories and knowledge, right? That people have gone through it. And I think the genetics piece. I was in the camp, like my dad had been diagnosed in 2010. My mom was a breast cancer survivor from 01, but then in 16. But when my dad got diagnosed, like genetics, I think really the shift started to turn in like 2018. Now it is mandated here in the United States, like any pancreatic cancer patient, they have to go through genetic testing. Now, some centers will only test the tumor, and sometimes you can have different, genomic sequencing on the tumor and on the patient. I was always of the camp like, hey, if I get it, what am I going to do? Like, if I get, why do genetic testing? Because like, what can you do about it? Now, that was the former thought process. I got really sick and had genetic testing. And then, I am also BRCA2 positive. Wasn't surprising because my mom in 16, when she went down the breast cancer road, like they did the genetic testing, she wanted it in 01 and insurance was like, well, it's a $5,000 payment. We're not going to do it. But now my family history with my dad and my mom and my grandfather and my aunt, we have a lot of cancer. And so, but when I got sick in 18, it kind of forced my hand to do it. But Dan, I'm in the ballpark like you are now. Like my mindset shifted really quick because I think knowledge is power. And then the one thing that we have seen, as you're a testament to, is like there is a very good treatment protocol for these genetic mutations. And that's the one exciting piece within pancreatic cancer that we've realized. And that's why it's so critical to know your genetic marking, right? Like it's such a game changer. And that's like the really, I think, exciting piece in this space where we've seen, and we just had a researcher on, and that podcast just aired with a researcher at MD Anderson, Anna Brown-Mitra, and we talk about that. There still is the larger percentage is the sporadic risk or sporadic cases, right? We just don't know. Yep. But for genetics, like there's so much happening. And the tide is turning a bit in this space. Like now there's a lot of clinical trials. And like to your point, like you went on 2 clinical trials that you've had success with. And the reason we have to do these clinical trials is to have people with outcomes like you, right? Yeah. You're a testament to that. So like, if we don't do those trials, we don't move the needle forward in disease management.
Data. If we don't have data, then nothing changes. So
exactly. So it's huge. And so going into this, then to get back to your story here, was your mindset like? Did you know, like when you went to now I've got a couple questions about the European American healthcare system and that transition, but even before that, so when the lady in the ER or in Paris says, "Hey, you have this tumor on the pancreas," did you already know in the back of your head, like, hey, I have this BRCA and maybe my outcome is going to be a little bit like my
No,
treatment program? So you knew none of that.
no. I just knew pancreatic cancer was the one that if you got it and you got it in the wrong way, it could be very devastating very quick.
Yeah.
That was all I knew.
So now so the decision to go to Cleveland, was that because family, or you just knew like, hey, like systems?
It was probably both. I mean, the initial treatment I would have gotten in Paris would have been exactly the same as
Yeah.
in Cleveland. Same drugs, same protocol, same everything. Wouldn't have changed. In Paris, I would have been taking a taxi 35 minutes to and from my apartment to the hospital, and having to deal with our kids in a small 2-bedroom apartment.
Yeah.
In Cleveland, we had access to my mom's house, which was a house with a yard out back that the boys could play in, and the Cleveland Clinic has a great reputation, and it's just a lot more accessible. I could literally actually walk to the clinic from my house across the bridge, get chemo, and then a lot of days, if I was feeling strong enough, I would walk back. So, it was a mix of family, of just ease of life management. And then the next thing that came out, and we weren't thinking about this initially, I think some of my family members probably were, but my wife and I weren't. The next thing is there is just a truth in how these treatment processes go, that the new stuff comes out in America first.
Yeah.
If you're in Europe and you have the ability to get to the United States, either because of your insurance or otherwise, the new stuff comes out there first, and it's purely because the United States is such a big market, and the drug companies make a lot of money in the United States, and there are real downsides to that, huge downsides to that. It's an incredibly complex issue, but the positive side of it is the new stuff comes out, and that's where the new drugs and new treatments come out first. So, that in terms of our second and third step, that turned out to be very important.
It's kind of fascinating you just say that, right? Like, I mean, yeah, standard of care, I think across the world, I think economically is probably less expensive in, a public healthcare system, right? Like we've had patients that have come on, or I should say, survivors that have talked about like their stories and their journeys about like going to Mexico, right? And getting the same type of standard of care at a much lesser cost. But then when you talk about clinical trials, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, right? Like the United States is a leader in pharmacology and development, but
we can't. It becomes a very political question, which I understand. It's a very complex question about equity and fairness and access and all that stuff, and those are all real points. And there are disparities in the U.S. system which are horrendous and unfair. But if I was on blood thinners for a very long time because of my tumors,
blood clots, right?
Blood clots, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was on Xarelto. Xarelto in Paris costs €50 for 50 euros per month. Xarelto in Cleveland, Ohio costs $516. Now, that's madness.
Yeah.
It's also true that if the drug companies weren't making the amount of money they were making in the United States, Keytruda, which probably saved my life, wouldn't be out as quickly as it was. So I say it's like the agony and the ecstasy of the American healthcare system.
Yeah.
And it's in no way fair. It's probably not even just, but they are curing cancer. And so it's not to say that we shouldn't improve it or change it, or there shouldn't be ways to make sure more people get access to it. That absolutely should be happening. But we have to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we have to remember what real positive things come from that system as well.
Correct.
So,
yeah, you said that very eloquently, Dan. I usually just say no one works for free, right?
Yeah.
And we have this model, I think, like, and you see this in philanthropy, but then in drug development, right? Like, there's a cost of development, and there's, and unfortunately, like, we're in a capitalistic, not even United States, but a world, right? And
Mhm.
so, like, there's always going to be that market, the way that it's set up, and there's pluses and minuses. I like to look at the pluses, right? Like the positives out of that. And maybe we can find ways. And I think though, like the space as a whole, I mean, I know there's been a big issue here in the United States with, especially in the genetic space. I know from talking to other patients that are BRCA, like I think like 6 months ago, there was a real shortage of cisplatin, which is one of the platinum-based drugs that is beneficial for the genetic population in this space. And a couple of people were really vocal and were able to get to the Hill, and I think that's been addressed, hopefully. But that was, the economics of that drug, is very inexpensive to manufacture, and the pharmaceutical companies just don't make enough of it. They said it was kind of quality control issues, that there was a huge batch that got destroyed somehow because of quality control. But at the end of the day, it's like cost a quarter, that they make on it. So, there has to be balance, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and people speak about these issues as if they're simple. It's incredibly complicated. And I know three countries very well. I know France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. None of them are happy with the system, and they're all three totally different systems. So it's just, healthcare is a hugely complicated issue. And if somebody says, I know the answer, it's pretty simple. They have no idea what they're talking about. That's where I come down. Anytime somebody tries to say that they have the answer, they do not.
Correct. Back to your journey. So you start at Cleveland, the genetics. So you do the 9 months of chemo there. Was that like a combination? Like I mentioned cisplatin. So was it the BRCA combination that they're giving you? And so you have
I started cisplatin, but then I went to FOLFIRINOX, or the other way around. I can't remember.
Yep. And so how do you get to Sloan is the question that I have here. So is it just again through the family, or?
This is where I really think someone can come up with a better situation. I mean, it's madness to me that there are so many people going through this who want access to medical trials, but don't have any idea how to get to them. Yeah. And there are so many doctors and researchers who need people to participate in medical trials, but don't have access to the patients.
Correct.
It doesn't make any sense. And to the point around profit motive, the problem is there's no profit motive there, and so
Correct.
you can't get a market-based solution to it. And all of these research centers, they all exist in their own world. Like there's clinicaltrials.gov, which is what my family ended up using. But the only reason my family, my wife and my sister and my brothers were able to work through that is because they're doctors and they kind of can figure it out. And so they went on clinicaltrials.gov and figured out, which research centers were doing the most work. And it was MD Anderson and MSK, and which doctors there were attached to the most medical trials that matched up closest to my circumstances. And then they did the hard work of getting me appointments, virtual appointments or otherwise, and just went through it that way. And so probably about 2/3 of the way through that, my run through chemo, we started engaging with MD Anderson and MSK about, okay, once we're done with chemo, because my body, the body can't support it forever. Once we stop the chemo, what can we do? So that we were then, okay, we stopped chemo, and then when we knew I was going to go to the medical trial with the olaparib and the Keytruda. And then, that was a 2-year trial. And about a year into that trial, we started to have the conversation with Dr. O'Reilly, what happens next? And so it really was it's a very difficult thing to do. And I was lucky to have a support network of people who knew the vocabulary, who were comfortable engaging with doctors' offices and support staff and all that kind of stuff, who knew when to push and knew when to pull back, all those sort of soft skills that people I wouldn't have known. And I was lucky enough to have that sort of support network.
Yeah, the clinical trials. I mean, we've talked often about that here, and we had recently the chief medical director of Tempestai, and they're trying to originally they came out, great story, and not to go into the weeds of it, but the founder's wife was diagnosed with breast cancer. She had a genetic mutation, so they first originally launched, and I apologize if I'm not doing them justice to genetic sequence and genomic sequence like the entire population, because people who have genetic risk should understand that risk, similar to like what we talked about at the start of the podcast, right? Now they've come out, they've got this platform where they're trying to match people that have cancer and have certain genetics, certain genes to trials. And to your point, it's like, you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you type in like pancreatic cancer BRCA and you're like, oh my God, like it's like, trying to read, someone who's not in the medical profession trying to
code. It's another language.
Yeah, it's like code. Yeah, exactly. It's like looking at code and trying to like be a coder, right? And so it's very challenging. I know like PanCan does a very good job. Like they've got tumor. They're another group in the space, probably the largest group in the space, and they've got some resources. But still, then the challenging piece is like, okay, well, if they find a trial for you, it may not be in your geographical area. And you mentioned access, right? So like, how does someone in Akron, Ohio, who doesn't have the means get to MSK or MD Anderson, right? And so Tempus is trying to rock that boat a little bit and trying to bring trials to people. Like then you can go to your local oncologist in Akron and get access to that clinical trial. Yeah. That's super disruptive, which, it's going to take some time. So we had a podcast, we talked about that, but, I think that's part of the challenge, right? Is like access. But before even you get there is like information, right? And how are they able to decipher that information? And so you brought up incentive. That gets kind of a little wishy-washy when we try to like incentivize people to get into clinical trials. I know we've done some stuff. We've done some stuff in the past where we've incentivized like veterans with like Subway cards to like Subway, the restaurant, not the transportation system, to come in to do like not clinical trials, but just do like screening, like because there's a high occurrence, and this was with a diabetes cohort, which there's a potential link to pancreatic cancer. So like you're incentivizing patients with Subway restaurant food cards to come in and fill out questionnaires. So is there some sort of system like that where you incentivize people, maybe reimbursement of travel potentially to get to centers where these clinical trials are open? Not that that's an incentive, but just like you're eliminating a barrier to access to that clinical trial possibly.
Yeah, I mean, my point around the incentives is more that there is no organization in the middle that is incentivized to connect people. And I think it's Clinio. There's a few startups that are trying to do this now.
Yeah.
But like literally, you just need to find. I'm not talking about incentivizing patients to get into trials, but somehow connecting the trials with the patients. And there's a gap there. There's no player. There's not a big enough player in the middle that is able to have a material impact on the market yet. I think it will happen. It's the question I get most when people say, "Hey Dan, my aunt or my friend or my brother or whatever has cancer or pancreatic cancer. Would you mind talking to them?" And they were wondering, about clinical trials and stuff. And I said, well, first, talk to your doctor about what they know about clinical trials, because patients often don't even do that. Correct. There's also sort of a patient confidence thing where their patients often sit and they're passive with their doctor as opposed to being an active participant in it. So step one is to talk to your doctor and ask them what they know about clinical trials going on in their institution or in the region. And then number two is clinicaltrials.gov. But everybody wants to know that. Everybody hopes first of all, that there's the magic key out there that's going to cure them, which is probably not the case, but everybody wants to know it, and there's just very little information on it. So,
Dan, you and I know I alluded this to at the beginning when you first shared kind of the journey and the story, this confidence in your voice and telling the story. Loaded question here in the terms of like there's no right or wrong, but it's your answer here, and hindsight also being 2020. Was there a point in your story and in your journey where, because you speak like very, very confident, very factual, where you can look back and like there was a tipping point in this journey to have that? Or was this something that you like since day one, hey, when you went in and you had, that original conversation, with that doctor in Paris, like there was that confidence that, hey, like I'm going to get through this. I know you mentioned like, 40 years old, being invincible.
No. I was invincible until the person pointed at the screen, and said, "You've got a tumor on your pancreas," and then all of that invincibility just fell away. It's not like I was intentionally that way. I was just a young, dumb man who just couldn't conceive of their own mortality. That I still. I mean, how can I say this? I was sure I was not going to survive. I didn't even really consider survival. I never asked the doctor. I always told the doctors, do not give me a timeline. I do not want to know what the timeline is, because I was too fearful of it. At one meeting with one of my doctors early on when I first got to Cleveland, he said, I think we have a real possibility of getting you 6 or 7 years. And I fell apart. I mean, I had a panic attack. I was a puddle. I think I screamed and yelled. It was horrific. That was almost maybe the worst day of my life. So I didn't go into this thinking I'm going to survive it. And today, but even then going through it, there'd be times I would be walking down the street and I would have to stop and say to myself, I have pancreatic cancer, but it's impossible that I have pancreatic cancer. Like my mind could not actually understand it. There were times when I understood it to be true, but I still had never really fully digested that information. And now I'll be walking down the street and I will have to stop and think like, I don't have pancreatic cancer. That's impossible too. So at no point did I think I was going to survive it. And now I have to sort of allow myself the possibility that I will. And it's a really difficult, I'm outrageously lucky and it's an amazing position to be in, but it's very difficult once all of that crumbles, all of that edifice that you build up over youth crumbles, and somebody says you are vulnerable and mortal and you're probably going to die soon. It's very difficult to go to, even if somebody says, hey, you're good, go ahead, young man, enjoy your life, which nobody said that to me yet, but it's very difficult then to believe that in a way and allow yourself to be unconscious of the mortality that lurks behind. So it's an evolving process. I wouldn't say that I was never confident that I was going to survive, and I don't even know what to do with the information that I just got a month ago to say that I'm in remission. It's an evolving process.
Are there certain things that you do though to kind of keep that, like, this is like a mental struggle, as you say. And not that you said that, but I guess I'm putting it in my own words here. But so this mental struggle with that, have you found, and maybe give advice to people that, there's maybe someone who's listening or watching that gets diagnosed today and, they're 40 years old. Are there things that you've seen, over the past 4 years that have helped, with that dialogue?
Well, first, people are going to tell you just stay positive. That's the most important thing. That always drove me crazy. Because I know positivity matters, and I do know that there are studies that say if you have a positive attitude, but it's like saying to somebody who's standing in a hurricane, don't get wet. Yeah. Everybody knows being positive is better than being negative, but it always sort of drove me crazy. Stay positive. It's the most important thing. And I always thought, well, I think the chemo is going to be pretty important, but what I would say is stay physically active. I was always better when I could go for a walk. Just that amount, that was hugely important to me. Number two was, if a doctor gives you good information, take it as good information. Because after you're diagnosed, it's so hard. You just accumulate bad information. And then that becomes the only truth. And it's hard to let the good information break through. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I sort of actively try to do now is okay, if my doctor had told me something bad, I would be devastated. If my doctor is telling me something good, I have to try to find the strength and maybe joy in that. But it's a very active process for me, where I have to sit down and think, okay, I still have this terrible thing that's going on, but my doctor just gave me good information. So I'm going to experience that as good information. And then the third is just the daily life of just trying to find places to find joy. For me, it was my wife and my kids and my friends and my family, and just trying to find moments of peace and joy, where and however you can, and recognizing that the treatment process is going to be extremely difficult. You have to sort of submit yourself to it. And be humble in it. But it can't be your only thing. You have to find some peace and joy with your, whatever brings it to you, walking, running, spending time with your friends, family, kids, whatever it is.
Let's talk a little bit about running. I know you've mentioned running a bit. What's that been for you during this time? I mean, we do a lot of running, so we got to bring it up.
Yeah. So I 2 Novembers ago, I was in New York for treatment, and I just happened to be there during the New York Marathon. I'd always sort of exercise, but I'm not a very good runner, and I don't particularly enjoy it. But I always did it because it's a thing you can do, anxiety management or whatever. But I was in New York for the marathon, and in my hotel there were lots of people wearing purple shirts. And I said, so it was a Sunday, and I would have had treatment on Monday, and just kind of sitting around waiting for whatever. I said, oh, that's great. What are you guys running for? And they said, pancreatic cancer. And I said, oh, I have that. And it put it in my mind at that moment, if I get to the other side of this, remission or not, I never thought I'd be in any state of remission. But if I get into a spot where we've turned this into, say, a chronic illness, or I'm in a pretty stable place, I'm going to try to run the New York Marathon to raise money for Project Purple, because I don't imagine there's been all that many people who've run the New York Marathon for Project Purple who had pancreatic cancer. And I thought that would be a really good opportunity to raise money and make it happen. So I'm currently training. I just went for a run a little while ago along the Thames. Again, I'm not very good at it. I can't go very far yet, but my strategy for the marathon generally is I'm going to start, and then I'm going to go until somebody tells me that it's finished. That's my strategy.
Dan, I think a lot of us are not very good at running in terms of winning or professional. I always say, I guess I'll just, this has been 14 years of running on and off. And, this was started as a run charity, and then we've evolved, right? And because not everyone's a runner and not everyone can run marathons. But I always used to say that running, not a lot of people enjoy running, but there's a reason why we do it, right? Whether that's anxiety management or because of a cause like ours, right? And there's so many great causes, and running has been an amazing community to support so many great causes. I'm selfish in saying our cause is the most important, selfishly. But like your story and the people who are, there just to finish is what running is all about. Yeah, the professional runners are pretty amazing too, right? Like to see someone go that fast. And I've been blessed to meet some and to see some, I saw the world record, the women's world record. I was at mile 24 in London this year, and they set the lady set a woman's world record for the fastest marathon, and I was like, oh my god, like she was flying at mile 24. She looked like it was easy. And then last Chicago, unfortunately, sadly, the gentleman had passed, but he set the world record in Chicago, and Chicago, they were flying by at I've never seen a motorcade go that fast through our cheer zone at and we were at mile 13. I mean, the motorcycle bike was probably doing like 35 miles an hour, which you think on a marathon, that's like too fast because, you got people cutting in and out on the streets, but these guys were moving that fast. So that's super special, right? Like at that level. But the people that do it, for the reasons that we're doing it and for stories like yours, that's why. That's
an amazing thing about humanity. I mean, people like, it's I've never run a marathon. I don't intend to run a second. It's an incredible, people put them. I know everybody says,
be careful, be careful what you say. Cause I've heard this many times, Dan. I've heard this many times.
People put themselves through a lot of pain and struggle to do something, one for themselves to accomplish something, but two to raise money. And it's incredible. Sort of a funny story. I told my son, so I've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. I'm getting ready. I'm going to train and run a marathon. He's like, oh, how far is a marathon? I was like, it's 26 miles, and he has no concept of how long that is. And he said, so that's great, Dad. So do you think you can win?
Yeah.
And I said, Theodore, there is a 0% chance I'm going to win. He's like, well, what? I don't understand. I mean, if you practice and you train really hard, why can't you win? It's like, Theodore, there's going to be literally 15,000 people who finish in front of me, and I will be very happy with that result. But for him, he couldn't even process the information that his dad was engaging in a competition that he was not planning on winning. So,
you got to tell Theodore, yes, you won't win the race, but you will be the number one finisher of Americans from Cleveland living in Paris and at your age bracket,
exactly,
and a pancreatic cancer survivor. You will be number one in that. So you will win that. So I this is I just got chills and goosebumps hearing your story about the running. So I'm wondering if the people that you saw in the lobby were running with Project Purple, because that is just to me.
They definitely were.
So that's something I always tell people you just never know, Dan, is my point in sharing and asking that, and that's what the power of, again, going back to this story that you've told us, you just never know who you're going to inspire on the back end and why we continue to do the things we do. And, if no one listened to our podcast, and we got the one person to say hey, that helped me through that, that's the reason why we would do it. Just like our runners wear those purple shirts on race day, because you just never know who you're going to impact. So it's just so awesome. That's just so awesome. I can't wait for New York this year. New York, as we did throw it down and say it's not the greatest, it's not the most diversity. It might be the greatest diversity. London takes that, but greatest marathon. London has become very special for us, as I said. With the size of the team and everything that London has become for us, but New York is always going to be, I think, very, very special in our hearts here at Project Purple, because it was our first big marathon. It's our longest relationship, and New York brings it on race day, and we have a great time, and we usually have a wonderful team. So can't wait for that. I got a couple questions here left for you, and then we're going to share where our audience can connect with you. You talk about family a lot. You talk about your wife, your kids, your mom, your sister. How is that support? And I know before we hit record, we were talking about support systems and stuff like that. And you mentioned something early. You were like, hey, like, having siblings that are doctors, like I didn't have to worry about that. Like, trust in that. Like, what was that support like? And where I'm going to want to go with this, Dan, is like, we often hear, no one should ever fight alone. And some people have big families, some people have, their only child, but then they have, friends or neighbors, or, there's groups even, right? And so, as I said, no one ever fights alone, but let's talk about your situation. First question on that is like, what was it like to have that support in your corner as you went through this?
I think there's a very good chance that I wouldn't have survived, honestly. Both because of, literally getting access to those medical trials, but also just the ability to say, I'm going, it's kind of like, I sort of saw it as like, I'm going off to war.
Yeah.
And, every day I would sort of go to war and fight this thing that was inside of me. And I wouldn't have been able to go off to war if I didn't have the support of my wife, who moved from Paris to Cleveland and, lived in her mother-in-law's house, and they get along great, but that's a big thing. My sister basically took a break from her job and moved to Cleveland and was there to support us. My brother, Brian, and Shane, similarly incredibly supportive. And all of that was just basically, Dan, you go do what you need to do. We're here if you want to talk. And if you don't, we're here to help take care of your kids. I'm going to take your kid to the park. Yeah. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And it was just, when I was diagnosed and sort of drowning in the enormity of it, I couldn't handle another thing. Like I couldn't have even handled if somebody threw me the life vest. I would have been able to put it on. So I had to have people there to put my arms through the arm holes of the life vest. I mean, the enormity of it is overwhelming. And that support network, it's not really a support network. It minimizes it to call it that. It is like it was essential for my survival. I was lucky to have a largish family and friend group, but you don't need 1 million people. You need 1, 2, you need however many you can get, and it can be everything. One of the things I would say to people who are touched by cancer or have friends that have touched with cancer, one of the things I always told people is, don't worry, there's no form of words that are going to make this better. So don't worry about saying the right thing. Just showing up is enough. Just sending a message, hey, Dan, I'm thinking of you, is enough. People get very nervous about saying the wrong thing, so they don't say anything at all. But just say anything, because nobody could cure my pancreatic cancer. But I was grateful that I had so many people who weren't scared by it and just threw themselves into being with me and my family.
That's so powerful. I hope our audience listening, understands that, because I think, just to reiterate what you said, just showing up is powerful in itself, and being able to, like you said, like take your kids to the park, which is just, and this was my second question to this, was like, what's the best thing? And you answered it in it, because we often get people that call up and say, hey, my neighbor, my spouse, or, someone in my family just got diagnosed. What should I do? And people don't know. And you just knocked it out of the park. Like there's nothing, you don't have to show up. Yeah, there's something, but you don't have to show up with like a Cadillac filled with like fruit, right? Like just do something. And that's just so
you can't make the cancer go away. You can't fix it. It's not right. It's, what's happening to that person, what happened to me is a flipping disaster. Nobody can make it right. Nobody can fix it. But just show up, cup of coffee. And the thing is, in the middle of that stuff, people don't even know what they need. So if you ask somebody, which everybody means well, like if you need anything, call. But again, that person is drowning.
Yeah.
There is you can't even see the door. There's too much. You don't even know what you could possibly need at that moment. So somebody shows up and said, hey, I'm going to, like I said, take your kid to the park or to the zoo, or, hey, here's croissants, or, hey, I just made dinner and I brought it over, or I know you've got treatment on Tuesday morning. Can I take you there? Or what, it doesn't have to be anything. Nothing fixes any of this. You're not responsible for fixing it. It's just, but that person will not know what they need. They will not be able to say, hey, I need X, Y, and Z, because they're dealing with a bomb that just went off in their life.
So powerful. My last question here, Dan, and then we're going to share where our audience can connect with you, maybe follow your training journey as you get prepared for New York.
Yeah.
This is another loaded question. No right or wrong to this answer that you give us, but this is your answer. Given your experience, how do you define the term pancreatic cancer?
Oh, wow. Oh, man, that's a difficult one, because, again, it was only about a month ago that somebody used the word remission for me. So I'm really in the process of analyzing what that means. So, before, I would have said devastation, honestly, if I'm giving you the honest answer.
Mm-hmm.
But now, I don't want to say hope, because that is too cliched and trite and simplistic, and it's not quite true. There's light. There's light peeking out under the door. If we can just stay alive long enough, they're gonna cure it. We're curing cancer. People are curing cancers. And so before, I would have just said devastation. And now, not just because of my results, but because of what's happening in other cancers, there's light. It's not bright all the time. Sometimes it looks like it's way, way at the end of the tunnel, but there is a light there. And these things all of a sudden change. And so for me, my thought process back in the day was, I'm just going to try to stay alive long enough. And at some point, some really smart person in a laboratory is going to come up with the thing. I believe in humanity like that. And they're coming up with the thing. And so I wouldn't, hope is too trite, it's too cliched, but there's a light. There's light there, and it's getting brighter bit by bit, day by day.
Powerful, Dan. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to share your story, your journey. For the audience watching or listening, where's the best place if they want to follow along, connect with you?
Sure.
For that.
So I am Instagramming, such as a 44-year-old man can do, trying to keep it a little bit light and funny. I'm not sure everybody always gets my jokes on Instagram, but it's Dan McNamee 1. My wife tells me that the French people think I'm just ignorant, maybe, and not sure that the Americans know that I'm joking. So we'll see. So it's Dan McNamee 1. Awesome. And then my email, if anybody ever wants to reach out, I'm always open to helping or talking or pointing people in directions. It's danmcnamee@gmail.com. So DANMCN amee@gmail.com. So, follow along on Instagram. You'll see a kind of a broken down 44-year-old man trying to get himself into some sort of marathon shape, and or just send me an email. Happy to connect in any way.
I love it. I just went on to Instagram here, and I see you've got, well, you may get the best background scenery here as you train for New York with the bridges, with the tower, the bridges, the scenery. I love it, man. I love it. So I'm going to follow along as you go on this journey. Dan, thank you for allowing us the opportunity here at Project Purple, not only to share your story, but thank you for picking up the cause and being with us in New York for 2024. It's going to be epic.
Excited to be there. Let's raise a lot of money for it.
Thanks for being a guest on the Project Purple podcast.
Thank you.
That's a wrap of another episode of the Project Purple podcast. If you liked today's episode, feel free to share this episode. Make sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. That's a wrap of another episode of the Project Purple podcast. Thanks for listening and be safe. Until next time.